Liberty is a promise of many political ideologies, but one in particular carries liberty in its name: liberalism. Especially dominant among highly developed countries, liberalism has been very diverse, with many iterations over time. Liberals are broadly in pursuit of the ever-elusive concept of freedom, but different liberal movements have sharply disagreed on how freedom should be defined and how it should be implemented, and what role the government should take in private matters, economic affairs, and social welfare. In general, it seems to be the case that the core themes of liberalism are the individual, freedom, reason, justice, and toleration. But as we shall see, the meaning and importance of each of these principles has been in flux. The philosophical roots of liberalism can be found in the Enlightenment and the focus on reason and free thought. The English philosopher John Locke is often seen as one of the fathers of political liberalism. An advocate of religious freedom, Locke argued for a society of free citizens, each of them with the natural right to life, liberty, and property. According to Locke, it was the government's task to protect these rights, and that the people had the right to overthrow any government failing to protect them. When looking at the political dimension of early liberalism, we might consider first and foremost the American Revolution of 1776, which slightly deviated from John Locke's formulation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. U.S. Declaration of Independence. The United States of America was established as a very decentralized political unit, with wide-reaching autonomy for the various member states. The system was designed with several concerns in mind: the preservation of regional autonomy, the prevention of so-called tyrannies of the majority, and the creation of a rigid system of checks and balances between various branches of government. In Revolution-era political terms, such a system is called a republic, specifically as a counterpoint to the term democracy. Indeed, the term democracy was very negatively connotated for a long time, and it started to turn positive only in the early 1800s. This new American government pursued liberty, but it failed upon its foundation to resolve the abhorrent lack of freedom that was chattel slavery. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. Abraham Lincoln. Nonetheless, the American system with all its flaws became the primary precursor of the political system of liberal democracy, combining in a hybrid the principles of liberalism, that is to say, limited and accountable government and individual rights, with the principles of a democracy, government chosen by majority consensus from among competitive political actors. Liberal democracy is usually built on a strong constitutionalism to protect the individual from the collective and from the government, while also allowing the government to be ultimately chosen by the collective. Other precursors of liberalism could be seen in England's Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the French Revolution of 1789, both of which challenged monarchical absolutism. At this point, it might however be worth pointing out that the various liberal men of the era, be they American or French or British, did not generally consider women to be worthy of equal liberty, a hypocrisy that was noticed by the women in question. Female and male citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, must be equally eligible for all public honors, positions, and forms of employment, according to their ability and without any distinctions other than their virtues and their talents. Olympe de Gouges. The ongoing process of industrialization brought liberalism right into the middle of politics in the USA and the UK. Liberals not only pursued individual freedoms from political tyranny, but also economic freedoms from government overreach in the economy. Classical liberalism thus became a significant political force among the wealthy middle classes of the 19th century, Classical liberalism combined calls for individual liberty with demands for a new economic system that was to replace the dominant order of mercantilism, where society was dominated by government-enforced monopolies, tariffs, embargoes, and trade barriers. This new economic system, based on supply and demand economics, was capitalism. Classical liberals generally wanted the government to not intervene in the economy at all, something called laissez-faire capitalism. The conception of classical liberals on the idea of freedom was one we now identify as negative freedom, which is the freedom from outside interference. The dismissive attitude, which wealthy liberals adopted towards the impoverished working people, spoke to a remarkable presence of social Darwinism in classical liberal thought. Advocated by thinkers such as William Sumner and Herbert Spencer, social Darwinism gave classical liberals an excuse to ignore the suffering of the poor as a natural outcome of society, and justified their own wealth as an outcome of, to use Spencer's phrasing, survival of the fittest. As a result, classical liberals opposed any government intervention on behalf of the poor. Every bit of capital which is given to a shiftless and inefficient member of society is diverted from a reproductive use. William Sumner. In the meantime, continental Europe saw the emergence of liberal movements, mainly in a context of liberal nationalism. In the revolutions of 1830, national liberals played major roles in Belgium and Poland, and national liberalism had spread to most nations, especially Germany and Italy, during the revolutions of 1848. Dominant among continental liberals was the French constitutional liberalism of Benjamin Constant de Rebecque. German liberals, who did not yet have a nation-state to call their own, early adopted their own brand of a strong constitutionalism with an almost excessive focus on justice in what is called Rechtsstaat. A comparably nationalistic liberal movement existed in Italy, even though it was of course much more religiously Catholic. What showed itself was a rift between mainline liberals and radicals, with the former being constitutionalist, individualist, and identified with property rights, and the latter being more collectivist, egalitarian, and revolutionary. One of the core demands of radicals in the 19th century was universal suffrage, even though usually only universal male suffrage, whereas mainline liberals were often content to leave the lower classes largely disenfranchised. As the 19th century progressed, and as industrial society revealed itself with its entire ugly inequality, crushing poverty, inhumane working conditions, atrocious living standards, and child labor, it revealed itself to most observers that the classical liberal imagination of laissez-faire capitalism as the best way to bring about prosperity was misguided, and that the government needed to take a more proactive stance to improve the conditions of the misfortunate. British philosophers such as John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hill Green became leading thinkers of social liberalism. The conception of freedom turned from negative freedom to positive freedom, which is the freedom to achieve one's goals. There can be no freedom among men who act not willingly but under compulsion. Yet on the other hand, the mere removal of compulsion is in itself no contribution to true freedom. Thomas Hill Green. Social liberals raised sharp objections to the classical liberal conception of self-interest, which had resulted in such glaring social inequality, and instead argued for a moral framework where the average person's self-interest was not egoistic but altruistic, where everyone contributed to society so that society could help everyone. Social liberals were supportive of the establishment of welfare states. The British change towards social liberalism was inevitable. It was no longer sufficient to appeal to the wealthy middle classes, and a broad lower class appeal had to be attempted. This was a compromise towards the growing socialist movement, and the British social liberal Leonard Hobhouse even used the phrasing liberal socialism. The 1920s had brought unprecedented levels of diplomatic uncertainty to the liberal system. The victory in World War I had seemed like an excellent opportunity to establish liberal nation-states in all the various new countries, but many of them fell in the 1920s and 1930s into authoritarian nationalism. In Italy, the growth of the world's first fascist state was enabled by a perception of weakness and failure by the Italian liberal establishment, which had espoused a unique brand of elitist liberalism after the 1890s. Additionally, the creation in the year 1917 of the world's first communist state, Soviet Russia, caused anxiety among many liberals about a revolutionary overthrow in what was called a Red Scare. The economic crisis of the 1920s and 1930s also finally brought a form of social liberalism to the USA, where the adoption of New Deal policies by Franklin D. Roosevelt put the Democratic Party onto the path which it still follows to this day. The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Meanwhile, Germany, which had temporarily established one of the world's most progressive systems and a model welfare state in the form of the Weimar Republic, broke under numerous post-war socio-cultural and economic pressures and gave rise to one of history's least liberal regimes. And although World War II ended in fascist defeat, the victorious Allied powers quickly broke into a liberal Western Bloc and a communist Eastern Bloc, initiating the Cold War. The single most important economist of modern liberalism was likely John Maynard Keynes, whose Keynesianism encouraged the government to actively intervene in the economy and to generate economic demand by spending if it meant a positive impact on employment, investment, and economic growth. Keynesianism was the dominant economic doctrine of the British government between the 1940s and the 1970s, in what is called the post-war Keynesian consensus. The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already, and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which at present are not done at all. John Maynard Keynes. In the context of the Cold War, liberal values of self-determination and democracy suddenly proved secondary whenever economic and geostrategic interests of Western companies were seen as threatened by local socialists. Socialist-aligned leaders such as Patrice Lumumba in the Congo or Salvador Allende in Chile were toppled and assassinated in Western-backed military coups. The US chose to support the French attempt to continue colonial rule in Indochina, and after that failed, the Americans got themselves entangled in the Vietnam War. This military adventure was a massive point of domestic conflict in the US, already deeply divided by racial strife and assassinations, and found near universal disapproval in Europe, tarnishing the reputation of both the USA in particular and Western liberalism in general. On the European continent, liberal internationalism was at the core of the growing European integration, forming the ECSC in 1952 and the EEC in 1957, uniquely linking West Germany and France on the road towards the formation of the European Union, a structure which operates on broadly liberal principles and which is supported by most European liberals. The economic slump of the 1970s brought British Keynesianism into disrepute, as unemployment and inflation grew at the same time. The unpopularity of the massively bloated welfare budgets resulted in a resurgence in ideas more closely related to the old classical liberalism. But this neoliberalism was initially not advocated by liberal parties, but by the Conservatives, most notably Margaret Thatcher in the UK, but also Ronald Reagan in the US. We used to think that you could just spend your way out of a recession. I tell you, in all candor, that that option no longer exists. James Callaghan. The turn of the 1980s into the 1990s marked a high point in the history of liberalism, with the collapse of the Soviet Communist bloc. By the mid-1990s, many Western social liberals also had firmly adopted neoliberal viewpoints, most famously in the form of Bill Clinton proclaiming that the era of big government is over. But proclamations of an end of history and of the ultimate victory of liberal democracy might have been premature, as the 21st century has brought with it its own brand of non-liberal and anti-liberal challenges. Economic neoliberalism has been brought into a renewed image crisis by the 2008 financial crash. Leftists have renewed their attack on neoliberalism from a broad standpoint of democratic socialism, whereas rightists demand a new form of economic nationalism and oppose the globalized economic model. But several influential political parties and figures continue to wield the liberal banner. Liberalism has so far proven a formidable opponent to every ideology that has challenged it. We shall see whether its success can last. Thanks for watching. Cheers.